Yeah, just.
Oh, good morning.
The attack.
Okay.
I know, I didn't clean up that card.
It's hilarious. It's just those poor people who stay on the top. I know. Yeah. It's just, they're just trying to get people to sign up, register.
Yep, they also learn to get out the boat.
That's okay.
Oh, we stood by her.
Yeah.
And then, yeah.
Joe, are you staying out of trouble? Joe Gregor? Hey, Joe.
Yes.
Joe, are you deaf?
Come on.
I'm talking to you the whole time.
No,
You can put your mask on and then hear it.
Are you staying out of trouble?
no. Actually, I've gotten into a bit of trouble lately. I'm actually thinking of doing a change to the state slavery laws this year in the legislature. We've increased the penalties in involuntary servitude, mostly because, like, Berlin Turnpike, right?
Right.
And 2 years ago, there were 330 arrests for slavery.
Wow.
But one of the things that's not included in slavery, which Europeans are starting to change their laws to include, is indebted slavery.
We have to
So,
talk. Oh, my God.
you know, somebody from Syria
Right.
pays someone to help them immigrate, but then they charge them for the room on the Berlin Turnpike, whatever, $500 a week, but only pay them $400, so they continue. So they're essentially enslaved until it's paid off.
Right.
They never completely pay it off, and because not all of them are legal immigrants,
They're not gonna
they
charge you.
become captured essentially.
Would you like this to appear as a newspaper column in an ill-read newspaper?
At the what?
Would you like this to appear as an ill-read column in a small?
I love that column. I read it every day. You ask me too many questions.
Okay, can I contact you?
Yeah, let's talk.
Yeah.
What's the ill-read newspaper?
Hearst newspapers, I write for Hearst. It's
The
like
last-
you can't shoot me, you just keep.
One of two papers left in Connecticut.
Hi, everyone, I'm sorry to interrupt. We could ask favor, our guest Wi-Fi needs to be used for streaming purposes today, so if there's any way your phone can get off of it, we'd greatly appreciate it. I'm sorry that we have to ask this favor, but it's just for the event. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Great. Yeah, right.
All right. I want to welcome you all for coming. Going to get started a little early since we've been here a while. My name is Beth Burgess, Director of Collections and Research here at the Stowe Center. Saw most of you this morning, so nothing new here. For those who haven't and have just come for this event, this is part of our National Votes for Women Trail, the Hooker House marker dedication, which happened this morning at 10 a.m. down the street, 140 Hawthorne Street. So today we are honoring the Hookers for their women's rights advocacy. in the 19th century and its relevancy to us today, and how we can all be inspired to work like they did in our own world, make the world a better place. We are joined today by Susan Campbell, who's going to speak about Isabella and John. She wrote, of course, the biography of Isabella a few years ago now, so we're grateful that she's back. We are bringing this presentation to you as a joint effort with our partners at the Old State House, Connecticut's Old State House, as part of their legislative landmark series. Thank you so much. Really happy to work collaboratively on this project and many others, as of course the Stowe Center is a small to middle-sized museum, and in order to get our word out there and our mission out there and work collaboratively, we of course depend on partnerships like this. So thank you all for coming to us, for wanting to learn more, and we hope you enjoy the program. Mariana?
Okay, thank you so much, Beth. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. We're so grateful to the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center for partnering with us on this program, and also for agreeing to host the program. I know it was supposed to take place at the Old State House, but we're very happy to be here. The mission of the Connecticut Democracy Center is to inspire people of all ages to engage in civic life and strengthen their communities. We envision a society where everyone is empowered to participate in our democracy. Today's program is part of the Old State House's Legislative Landmark series. This series takes a look at some of the most significant pieces of legislation passed at the Old State House while it was still one of the capitals of Connecticut and housed the General Assembly. But more than that, the series takes a look at the individuals that shaped our state's laws through their actions and their words. As you will see from Susan's presentation, Isabella Beecher Hooker and her husband John exemplify these values. Their story is one of how regular citizens saw injustice in their society and dedicated their lives to mobilizing for change through civic action. Their work has had real and tangible impact on the lives of people in Connecticut in the form of the 1877 Women's Property Act. And it serves as an inspiration for all those who are still fighting for change and justice and equality 100 years later. The Hookers may have had the strength of a famous name, but I hope their story will show everybody that anyone can have a profound impact on their society if they make their voices heard. So that's why I want to thank you all for being here today for this program, to hear stories like this. It's very important to know stories like this. And without further ado, I just want to present Susan. That's who you want to hear about, right? So Susan Campbell is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, a widely read Hartford Courant columnist, and the author of 3 books. The books are here. Obviously, Tempest Tossed, The Spirit of Isabella Beecher Hooker, Frog Hollow, Stories from an American Neighborhood, and Dating Jesus, a story of fundamentalism, feminism, and the American girl. So without further ado, Susan.
You saw me kept trying to pop up. I can't wait to talk about Isabella. It's a little bit of an obsession for me. Thank you so much for coming today and sweating outside and now in wonderful air-conditioned comfort. I just want to talk a little bit about Isabella Beecher Hooker and her husband, John. My focus was on Isabella Beecher when I wrote the book years ago, but John was such an important part of her development as a person and not just as a husband. They had a very unpromising beginning. John Hooker was interning at the law office of his brother-in-law. There was another gentleman in the office who also happened to be Isabella Beecher's brother-in-law. And Isabella Beecher had been kind of shunted around her older siblings, her older half-siblings' homes after her mother, Harriet Porter, died. Harriet Porter was Lyman Beecher's second wife. She was, this is going to sound cruel, not really up to the task. She came from quite a lot of money and then became a minister's wife. He had lost his first wife, his beloved first wife, and left children who were still mourning, and she stepped into that role and almost immediately took to bed. She was not well. We know that she at least visited with Lyman a few times. The result of one of those visits was Isabella had to be discreet and gracious describing that. But her mother, Harriet Porter died when Isabella was a teenager. And so her older siblings, who were a little bit controlling and wanted to make sure she was okay, began to move her around. So she ended up in Hartford with the really only private Beecher ever, Mary, who was married to the attorney Thomas Perkins, who was in the office where John Hooker was interning. At that time, you could go to a law school, but the more common way to become an attorney was to go to an attorney's office and read the law with them. He took one look at her and decided, yes, I think I love her. And she had seen marriage up close and thought, no, thank you, I don't want that. John Hooker was the son of a learned educator. He was related to Thomas Hooker, who in Connecticut hasn't heard of him. He had really bold-faced names in his family tree. And as I said, he was studying at the law office, which is still ongoing. This is a free ad for that law office. On the other hand, Isabella Beecher was the daughter of an incredibly influential minister. Think Billy Graham plus another minister you might actually like, who had television shows and all of that. Lyman Beecher had such an influence. He was a Calvinist. His sermons were circulated. Can you imagine even talking about the sermon you listened to on a Sunday, as opposed to, at that time, really the influential people were ministers. It wasn't business titans. It was the ministers. But they weren't wealthy. He had a lot of influence, Lyman Beecher, as did all of his sons who followed him into the ministry. But the Beecher family did not have a lot of money. So she was accustomed to growing up with not a lot of resources. Although her father was radical for his time in that he wanted his daughters to be educated, Isabella, given the turmoil at home, really never attended school more than 2 years in a row. She was in a very smart intellectual family, but she did not have formal schooling, which was quite the opposite of John Hooker. So what to do? So everybody in the Beecher family, or if they were Beecher adjacent, wrote letters, a lot of letters. And the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center has, I think, every last one of them that went between John Hooker and Isabella Beecher. And so they would argue back and forth. And it was interesting because you can really get to know someone if you read letters that were written unguarded. Thank God emails aren't forever. I do not want to be judged on my emails. But these letters they showed two intellectual powerhouses, despite Isabella's lack of formal training, who weren't afraid to argue. And this was something that Isabella wrote to John. Kind of a big no thank you. It wasn't John Hooker who wasn't attractive to her. It was the idea of marriage, because Isabella had seen her siblings' marriages up close. If you have significantly younger siblings and they come visiting, you probably don't put on the dog. They get to see you in all your glory. I have a sister who's 14 years younger than I. She's heard everything, every argument I've ever had with my husband, because I don't have to dress it up for her. In the same way, Isabella was privy to these agonized discussions between her siblings and their spouses, and came away thinking, no, thank you, particularly for the females. Catherine, the older daughter, never married. But her other sisters, including Harriet, everyone's heard of Harriet, had these relationships with their spouses that she did not find pleasing. And she also knew that given the time and place, if she got married, she would be tucked under the right arm of her husband, never to be heard of again. And she was a Beecher, so she figured she was worth more than that. So this was her thought on marriage, and this was something that John had to overcome. So she got a lot of pressure from her highly theological family that, of course, anyone she would marry would become a minister. What else is there? But John was a born lawyer, and he gave divinity school a month. and didn't like it and left. So he gave it the old college try because he very much wanted to be accepted by the Beechers, but most particularly Isabella. And this was one thing that Isabella wrote in one of her letters. This was the crux, though. As they were talking, and this went over the course of some time, these letters back and forth, Isabella said, fine, I will get married to you. But if you find a better offer, take it. And at that time, that was a pretty radical thing, because if a woman was engaged to be married, then it was assumed that that engagement would end in marriage. And if it didn't, it was the woman's fault and she probably was a slut. So by Isabella saying, okay, we'll get married, but if you decide against it, I'm okay with that, she was taking a huge risk, because if John should have stumbled upon a woman who was perhaps more to his liking and broken the engagement, he would have suffered very little. All the blame would have fallen on Isabella. So she's coming around. It was basically, oh, all right, we'll get married. I'm not going to like it, but we'll get married. And one of the things he said to her, and I couldn't find a copy of the letter, and I'm intuiting that this was said from one of the letters I read from Isabella, was that John said, if I wanted a marriage such as you describe, I'd get a dog. I don't want a dog. I want to be married to you. And then the most romantic letter ever, where she said, oh, all right. My family's going to be in Hartford in August on this date at this time. We'll get married then and we'll save everyone a trip, which is like, she's not entering into it in the fullness of love. It's more, okay, I know I have to get married. I don't really have any job prospects, even though she could see that her unmarried sister, Catherine, could have quite a career telling everyone how to raise their children, the woman who'd never had children or been married, and could be the Martha Stewart of her day on speed. But Isabella didn't necessarily see that for herself. So this is actually satire. It wasn't a romantic letter. It was more like a business transaction, which in fact, a lot of marriages at the time were. Blackstone's commentary. So they became a real team in an incredible way, given all the arguments that they had in all their letters. So Isabella would take her knitting to John's office, or sometimes to a reading room. When they first got married, they didn't live in the house down the street. They lived with his parents in Farmington. And she would read the local newspapers to him, and he would read Blackstone's commentary to her. When John had been in undergraduate school at Yale, he'd gotten sick and he'd tried to catch up and he'd ruined his eyes. He always had bad eyesight after that. So she would sometimes read Blackstone commentary to him, but she wanted to make sure he kept up with the news of the day, like at the Current. The problem was, one day she came across that portion that talked about how a woman disappears after she gets married, that the marriage contract was basically the last contract she would ever sign. Imagine everything hinged, if you were a woman, on your choice of husband. That would dictate what you ate, what you wore, where you lived, how much money you had, how many children you had, your politics. And she came across that piece that said, obviously after marriage, a woman becomes like an appendage to her husband. And he had to bring up the dog thing again. Listen, if I wanted a marriage like that, like your poem said, if I wanted a marriage like that, I would get a dog. I want a marriage of equals. So the Hookers had 4 children, 3 of whom lived to adulthood, all of whom in one way or the other, Isabella picked fights with, because that's what she did. She really paid attention to being a mother. And I think some of that was because her mother had died when she was at a really important age, and she wasn't quite clear on how to do it. And she devoted journals, her motherhood journals, to not issues of the day necessarily, although that's sprinkled throughout, but more in, I sinned with my tongue with Alice today, which she yelled at her daughter and felt bad about it. I'm not exactly sure what kind of curtains to put in the dining room. When they moved into the house down the street in 1853, that presented a real conundrum to Isabella, who, as I said, had grown up not wealthy. And here she had a mansion. a beautiful mansion. And I have to say from her writing, she felt guilty about that her whole life. She did give away a lot of money throughout her life, but the fact that she went from being poor as a church mouse to the wife of an incredibly respected attorney who lived in a mansion in Nook Farm was a little bit weird for her. But they always had time to discuss issues of the day. They would do that in the morning as John got ready to go to work. They would do that in the evening. They would do that throughout the day when she would drop in on him in his office. And this was the big one. And this is a real indication that Isabella did have a mind that she could change. The Beechers believed that slavery was wrong, that it was an abomination. Most of them were not quite there. They weren't quite what were called whole-souled abolitionists. They thought that the people who'd been enslaved should be freed, then loaded onto boats and sent back to Africa, which is a misnomer because some of them had been here for generations, some of the people who'd been held in slavery. John was a whole-souled abolitionist. The people who had been enslaved should be freed, and then they should be given agency. They should be able to vote, own property, and that was really radical. And we were talking about John earlier, you and I, about how could he get away with being so radical? He was from Thomas Hooker. He was of the Hooker family. He had a fabulous reputation, and he was a decent guy, so he could get away with saying some of these things. He was a man that his wife and others maybe couldn't. So early on, Isabella said she disliked abolitionists more than slavery. I'm not sure I would have said that out loud. But John was a committed abolitionist, and he would give her articles and books to read. And he didn't treat her as a, there, let me teach you, but maybe you want to read this. Maybe you want to expand your mind a little bit here. And she became a whole-souled abolitionist and began to insert that kind of thinking into the round-robin letters that the Beecher siblings would send around. The Beecher siblings did not like their baby sister telling them anything. So that wasn't always popular. And I have to say that Isabella was not always the most diplomatic, which is one reason I love her. This was another issue of the day, and they were on the same page with this. And they were tireless campaigners, and that plaque couldn't be more deserved down the street. They traveled extensively, particularly Isabella. They wrote articles, they wrote books, and they funded, in fact, they were the sole funders for several local and state suffrage organizations. It just didn't make sense to either one of them. Now imagine John Hooker growing up with quite a lot of money, quite a lot of influence, what we would now call privilege, looking around and saying something isn't right and being very clear on that. They did organize a suffrage convention in October 1869, and she founded the Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association and worked personally to try to bring together the different factions of the national suffrage organizations. There was a split. There was a lot of discussion as to how best to affect votes for women, whether it should be an amendment, whether it should be a state by state. And there was Isabella, who was kind of accustomed to being the little sister and bringing everyone together. She wasn't entirely successful, but John wrote the bylaws for the Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association. She also edited speeches. Not that Elizabeth Cady Stanton or Susan B. Anthony liked it, but she edited speeches. This is one thing I love about Isabella, is she inserted herself into places where maybe it made people uncomfortable. God, I admire that. Because she didn't worry necessarily about public censor. She'd grown up the little sister, the dismissed little sister, there, and had almost gotten accustomed to it. And to her vast credit, never let that keep her from talking anyway. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony used to exchange letters, and sometimes they talked about Isabella, and it wasn't always positive. And it was like, she's like a new convert. My God, she won't stop. And that's true. She was like a new convert, and my God, she wouldn't stop. And she would write letters to the current, and they would vary in topics from suffrage to abolition to where to find the best flowers in town. So she still kept one little toe in the motherhood journals, but most of her writing and her speeches had to do with, come on, doesn't this just make sense? Give women the vote. I've been asked this recently, particularly after the Supreme Court decision that ended Roe v. Wade. I don't put words into dead people's mouths. And it was a different time and a different place, but I take great comfort from this particular line from an 1870 magazine article. Let no man fear than to trust women the guidance of her own life in all ages to come. Kind of says it all. I really would love to see her on Twitter right now. I would pay money to see her give speeches right now. I don't think there would be any holds barred, and I think there would be blood on the walls. And I think she would do it in such a classy way that people wouldn't even realize she just ran her sword through your gut, and you don't even know till 20 minutes later. John Hooker wrote to the Current in favor of Susan B. Anthony, who had voted illegal in 1872. She never paid that fine. I admire that too. He also took on Mary Hall as an apprentice, and she is Connecticut's first woman lawyer. And he was able to do that again by force of will. I will say that John Hooker was quirky in his own right, and that makes me like him even more. He wasn't the solid, never say anything wrong. He would say things in public that people sometimes would look at each other like, did he just say that? But it was John Hooker. And again, because his reputation was so wonderful and because he put his money where his mouth is or was, he could get away with it. There are some things that I think were patently unfair in that both of them embrace spiritualism, the idea that the veil between living and dead is pretty thin and you can still talk to people who've died because no one ever really dies. And John Hooker would go around and talk to various ministerial alliances and discuss spiritualism and suffer no public censor for it whatsoever. Isabella Beecher Hooker, after she died, one of the headlines in my Hartford Current was, Mrs. Hooker talks to spirits. And then the story proceeds to make fun of her. So did Abraham Lincoln. So did Mary Todd Lincoln. Weird that the ones who are female took the brunt of the public jokes for talking to spirits. And I want to mention this because this was actually a feather in the cap. This is this was alluded to earlier, the Married Women's Property Act of 1877. When I said when a woman got married, that was her last contract that she would ever sign prior to this. John and Isabella Beecher Hooker began lobbying for this act in 1870, and they lobbied hard, and they brought it up every legislative session until 7 years later when Connecticut legislators passed it. And these are some of the things that it allowed. And it was passed in the old State House, and it was one of the last pieces of legislation to be passed in the old State House before they moved to what is now our beautiful State House, the Capitol building. It's just hard to imagine not being able to own property. It's hard to imagine having to wait for your husband to die to have any say in the family money. That's not a happy thought. And these are some of the big, bold-faced names who responded. This was a big deal. And this was something that was before a lot of other states. 1877 preceded a lot of other states giving the same kind of power to women or right to women. This is from the governor, who was a friend. That's another thing about that house, and I mentioned it earlier, not in the speech, but that house was the locus for everything. It was where everybody stayed. Any of the big speakers who would come to Hartford would stay with the Hookers. The other houses were either too tumultuous, too many family members coming and going. Samuel Clemens wasn't really that much of a host. He kind of liked his alone time. But the Beecher Hooker house was where people wanted to come. And I'm trying to imagine what it was like to be there in the morning and just want to eat your eggs. And there's Isabella, talking to you. And the Current also said that she suffered from too big of a personality, basically. And I think about what a sexist thing to say. Go Current. That what a sexist thing to say, that this woman who didn't want to fit in this little bitty box that was given to her, and this man who married her, understanding that she was not going to fit in that little bitty box that society wanted to give to her. And yes, they were a privileged couple, but sometimes that can work against someone's ability or desire to be outspoken. You don't want to lose that privilege. They didn't care. And I don't know if they thought like John Hooker just walked through life with this understanding that he would be accepted. He's of the Thomas Hookers. But they didn't care because right was right, wrong was wrong, and they needed to call it out. And they took great risk in doing that. Most of that fell on Isabella Beecher Hooker, the public censor and the dismissiveness and things that she'd lived with all of her life, but they didn't stop. They loved each other very much. And even in all the back and forth, at one point, John got mad because Isabella would send photos out to people who asked, do you have a photo of yourself, like an autographed picture? They did that even then. And she was sending out a particular photo, and he said, you look like one of those dancing girls. And it was in a letter that he said this, and she let him, how dare you call me, your wife, a hoochie coochie girl? I am not. I'm a woman of intellect, and you know it. And I don't know what his answer was. It was probably like whipped puppy, tail between the legs. I'm so sorry, I'll never say that again. But probably not. They probably went at it back and forth. The subsequent letters aren't included. They loved each other very much. They confounded each other on significant levels. And they were each other's best friend. And so you have this hothouse environment in this home where these two would get conversations going that would bring in so many other people, because that's what democracy is supposed to be. It's supposed to be conversation that bubbles up, maybe from the home, maybe from school, maybe from wherever, maybe from this room. And everyone gets a say. And they were very clear on that. And they were very clear on using their privilege for something besides accumulating more money. They didn't need more money, and they didn't need more power. Although Isabella wanted to be president, and I get that, I do too, but I don't think either of us have the skills, so we're just going to move on with that. She believed that the United States could be a matriarchy, and it should, and that she would just step in and be a president. One of the pictures I showed was of her brother, Henry Ward Beecher, and I was talking about this book previously. The Most Famous Men in America is one of my favorite history books. It's Debbie Applegate's look at Henry Ward Beecher, who was involved in a delicious scandal that had to do with going outside his marital vows. He was the kind of minister who, there was one wag said, I think it was in one of the New York papers, that when Reverend Henry Ward Beecher gave a sermon, no less than 13 of his mistresses heard it every Sunday. And at one point, this cleaved the family when news of this affair, and it wasn't alleged, he did it. But the rest of the Beechers were very quick to circle the wagons when the accusations were flying and saying, oh, he's a man of God. Yeah, and there was Isabella in her not terribly artful way saying, he did it, to the point that it offended Mrs. Ward Beecher, where she wouldn't even let her see her brother as he was dying later on. And Isabella couldn't stop saying, he did it, because in her mind, there's right, there's wrong, and you need to call it out, even if it's someone you love very much. Henry Ward Beecher had done the wrong thing. And during all that time, another inartful thing, she said inelegant thing at the least, was that Henry Ward Beecher needed to step down from his lofty position at Plymouth Church in New York, and she would take over and preach, and he'd get right with God, then he could come back. You know how that went over, right? Like a lead balloon. Come on now. But there was Isabella thinking there's right and there's wrong, and you need to call it out when it's wrong. And here, I'll help. And she, as I was researching her for the book, I just kept thinking I have friends like this, and I may be like this, where they talk, and then they say that extra statement, and you think, oh, if you just stopped right there, but you had to say that. All the time. That's how she approached life. But it made her a very effective and scary negotiator. She would say what needed to be said to get things done. If you were to read any of her articles, they're very diplomatic, they're beautiful. And then you read a speech and think, whoa, she let the dogs out. That's cool. And she didn't give up. And neither did John. Several of us have talked today about how disappointing it must be to have this goal. They saw abolition. They saw that through. They weren't able to see suffrage through. They weren't able to see a point where women, all women, could vote. And Isabella wrote an article for Connecticut magazine in the early 1900s after John had died. And that was a blow that she never really recovered from. And she included this particular poem. So she had a kind of hopefulness that, okay, I may not get to see this, but at least we worked hard and we tried to convince people, and other people will win where I have failed. I find it kind of sad that she thought she failed, because if you pay attention at all to history, we love our generals and we love our presidents. Maybe we don't love them individually, but that's what we want to talk about. We want to talk about troop movements and legislators, and we forget that it's not just about the people in the room at the time of the vote. There are people who built the table. There are people who pushed those people into the room. There are people who stood back and said, you better vote this way. We don't talk about them. And so our history skims the top of what really happened. And we don't know enough about people like Isabella Beecher Hooker and John Hooker. If you're in Connecticut, you may have heard of them. You know the Beechers. But you may not know the extreme importance of these two people's lives. And these are just two other people. I can't wait to see the other plaques, because I'm hoping that will direct our attention to people who've been overlooked. If two people of privilege can be overlooked, we're overlooking so many people who had so much to do with what we have now as a society, because nothing just happens. And we know that legislators don't vote for the good of the people all the time, that it takes the people saying, you better vote this way, or I'm going to make it difficult. And that's what they did. And I will always be grateful for them. So I'll just end with, this event just feels right. It's really wonderful to see these two get the notice. And I want to thank everyone who's involved. I won't read them aloud, but I hope we take away from this, one, that, as I said outside, Isabella Beecher Hooker would have loved that it was, and her husband, John, and that she got first billing. And that's okay, because she spent her life not getting first billing. And I hope we also take away that it can be the smallest thing. Like, you look at politics and you look at political decisions, and it can seem like such a big world. And I'm just that one person. You have no idea the importance of what you're doing. The sad thing is when you do nothing. And I think, if anything, recent political events and recent votes taken in Washington show that pressure from regular folk can move mountains. So I will open it up to questions or comments. We have a microphone, so we're recording. I'm just standing here. This is being recorded. So if you want to just raise your hand and then wait until you have a microphone in front of you, that would be great. Why, the lovely lady in white. Let me go back to, try not to look. Go ahead.
I would love to know your take on John's reaction to Isabella being friends with, shall we say, the
Virginia Woodhull.
yes, the family Woodhull.
Does everyone know who? Okay, you really, Virginia. I just made up a new person. You really need to read up on Victoria Woodhull, who ran for president, was a newspaper publisher, was also working on Wall Street, may have been a prostitute. I don't know that for sure, but all signs point to. She was a fascinating woman in the 1870s, say. And Isabella, in true form, was enthralled with her. And I think she was enthralled with her for all kinds of reasons, not all of them good. Here was Victoria Woodhull living her life, and also with a big personality, with no one saying stop doing that, although everybody was saying stop doing that. But Victoria Woodhull didn't seem to care. And the family, the Beecher family, was very concerned about Isabella's relationship with Victoria Woodhull, in part because Victoria Woodhull was one of the first journalists to publish anything about the scandal with Henry Ward Beecher and his affairs. with me so far? I need a flow chart, don't I? John was appalled that she was colluding with Victoria Woodhull. This is my impression. And they did write letters back and forth where he was saying, I think you want to think about who you're hanging out with. I think you want to just think about your own reputation and how that, and for Isabella, there was no going back once she latched on to Victoria Woodhull. The relationship eventually cooled, and I can't tell you the details because I don't remember them. But that was a bridge too far for John. That there were, you really need to read about some of these early suffragists. They were fat, like, especially in connection with the free love movement and things that I look at and think, oh, I don't think so. But there were so many interesting discussions going around about women's agency, and Victoria Woodhull moved the conversation in a direction that John Hooker didn't appreciate. Is that your understanding of it?
Yeah.
It was like, no.
She did an about face, Isabella did an about face because she was anti-Woodhull until she went down there and met her. Sorry.
Isabella did an about face because she saw, I think, Victoria Woodhull as a threat to her family. And then she met her in DC and heard her speak, and it was like love at first sight. And there were even rumors that there was beyond a filial love. I saw no evidence of that. But yeah, Victoria Woodhull must have been a fabulous speaker because a lot of people became enthralled with her when they heard her talk. Oh, to have that power. Wouldn't that be awesome? I would use it for bad. Thank you for that. Any other questions? You just don't want to leave the air conditioning because...
Hi, I just have a question about what was Isabella Beecher Hooker's thoughts on specifically like women of color and their ideal suffragette, like as she being a suffragette? Just want to know.
That's a great question because a lot of the early suffrage movement overlooked entirely anyone who wasn't not only white but wealthy. And to be honest, I think I can't say that I saw Isabella pushing the conversation very much toward women of color, which doesn't jibe with her whole-souled abolitionism. And maybe that's just my lack of research, and I don't want to impugn or say anything naughty about her, but I didn't see a lot in her writing, and that goes beyond oversight. And I have this argument with my history teacher aunt. Well, it was a time and place. No, I'm sorry, it's not. So I can't say that her abolitionist feelings, her cred, absolutely, she earned it. Suffrage, I think, was what a lot of the names I've talked about, it was for wealthier white women. There was still not only a class distinction, but a racial distinction that I think we do need to look at. That's a great question. I'm sorry. I wish I could say something better. But I didn't see a lot of her writing about anything like that. And when we do history, when we look at history, we really do need to be asking those questions, which for years were not asked. And I think that has contributed to some mindsets that we should have abandoned a long time ago. Did I just speak in code? I didn't mean to. We need to tell the whole story. And that's part of the story I think we've been able to not look at because it's unpleasant. But yes, it is unpleasant, but we need to look at it. Thank you for that. Any other questions? Make them easy. No? I so appreciate this. Oh, Joe has a question. All right. I hope it's easy. Actually, I'm staying here.
So many people passed through the house, and they had so many friends from so many different disciplines, and they were prominent in the community here. What were the parties like? Like, did they entertain like that, or was it just dinner parties, or what was the fun part of it?
Every moment of it. Beth, jump in anywhere.
I was thinking of that crazy party.
Oh, the tomahawk one? Okay, so if you have a party and it involves a tomahawk, you have a party. In college, we used to call them a two helicopter, where 2 helicopters from the police have to come and break them up. It wasn't wild, but it was they were loud. They were well stocked on liquor and and food. There was one New Year's Eve party, correct me because I'm pulling this out of the back of my brain, where Isabella was upstairs channeling dead people. She was a spiritualist. And she came at one point running down the stairs with a tomahawk. I don't know where she got it. And disturbed the peace, shall we say, channeling a native leader. Of course, she's not going to channel some, yeah, it's going to be some big deal. And around that time, Mark Twain said, "I'm out. We're not, you can't come back here anymore. We're leaving." He didn't hold to that. Mark Twain, I'm from Missouri too. And can I just say to CTN that he had issues with spiritualism as well, even though his wife was cured by a spiritualist healer when she was a teenager and hurt her back. He did not love Isabella. And it might have been two big personalities, too big for a room. One of you need to go out there and the other one can stay. But it was, now I will say that that party with the tomahawk wasn't necessarily indicative of all the parties, but you really did have to bring your A game conversationally. Have we all been to parties where you just can't wait to leave? These were not those parties. These were parties meant to foment a lot of discussion and perhaps movements. So I would have loved to have gone to one. I don't know if I could have held my own conversationally, but it would have been fun to try. You would have done great. Any other questions? Yes.
Hi. The house itself, speaking of the house, I wonder if there's any record of what Isabella might make of the fact that the house now is lived in by residents who are more similar to her early background than her later times. And so one thought that occurs to me is we here at the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center have awarded a prize for Evicted, a book that talks about, housing, affordable housing being a problem mostly not on the, supply side is often, I guess, a focus, not enough housing, but rather on the demand. The economic inequality is such that people can't afford it. So in hosting visitors here, sometimes I find myself, maybe speculating that maybe this is very fitting for Isabella, that the house is now at least making a small dent in that affordable housing problem. But I wonder if you have any record, any thoughts.
No, but I wish I'd had that thought. I wish I could claim that one. That's a good one. It's actually true because we all know the affordable housing dearth in Connecticut in general. And there tends to be more affordable housing in the cities, but there's still not enough. And we lose people because they can't afford to live in the towns that they work in, and they have to commute places, and that causes its own kinds of problems. But I do think that's a great thought. It's fitting that the people who are living in the Beecher Hooker house now are more on the income bracket, comparatively speaking, of Isabella Beecher's growing up. They're not wealthy, but what a cool place to live. You're right. And I think the longer, there are initiatives within the legislature, and I don't want to make it sound like no one's paying attention to this, but it took so long. And Connecticut has priced itself out of people. I can't see you well, but I don't think you're as old as me, right? We've priced ourselves out of your market and to our deficit. It's going to be, we're also a rapidly aging state. I'm glad I'm still here, but that also presents certain challenges. And we have to have more affordable housing. We have to keep people where they want to stay and not where they have to live because they can't afford somewhere else. Thank you. I'm going to steal that. Pretend I came up with it. Any others? Yes, ma'am.
Can you comment a little bit on the connection or the relationship between Isabella and Susan B. Anthony? I can't quite figure out in my reading.
How deep are you in the new book you're reading?
3/4 of the way. Yeah.
I didn't get the sense it was a warm relationship, and I'm looking at Beth because she knows everything. And it's hard to tell, again, if it's an ego thing. I don't know Susan B. Anthony's history, past, future, anything well enough to comment on her ego. Isabella had a pretty healthy one. And I do think she was inelegant in some ways when she got involved in the suffrage movement. I think she could have been a little more diplomatic. My sense, and I'm drawing all of my thinking about Susan B. Anthony's thinking about Isabella from an exchange between Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Anthony, where they were making fun of her, like, oh my God, shut her up kind of thing. Not those words, much better words, but more, it's, I remember my first beer, if you could just calm down a little, we'll be fine. But I don't think that was because Isabella was a recent convert. That was her personality. And I think it probably rubbed Susan B. Anthony wrong. Yeah.
I agree. The interloper into this mix, right? The puppy who's ready to take charge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's true. And I think there were a lot of egos involved. There's a lot of egos involved in every movement. And of course, we've had the benefit of hindsight to look at the suffrage movement and put everyone in their boxes. And this was their personality. So of course it would fail this long. And I don't think that's necessarily accurate, but she was enthusiastic. But again, she was enthusiastic about everything. I don't know how she kept her energy level up, but she did. Any others? Sure. You get a second one. Yours was good. If it's a bad question last time, we wouldn't give you the mic.
I'm sorry. No, it just so I think sometimes what we do here at the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center is I think we try to look at Harriet as like a whole person with faults and good deeds. And so I was just wondering, someone who knows so much about Isabella and John, what would you consider your biggest criticism of Isabella? Or what would be something that you wished Isabella had foresight of seeing within reflection upon herself to change?
That's a great question, because you really get to know someone when you're researching and doing a book on them, and you think you know them really well. My criticism of her is also my in that she would say that extra thing that probably could have been left off the table, that she's going along and this is real, I'm with you. And then why did you say that? And having done that multiple times in print and in person, I get the urge to do that. That made her more real to me. There were a couple of times when I would be reading letters, I don't know what this is, reading letters that she was writing to either John or someone very close to her. And I would think, oh, you so misinterpreted that because you went straight 0 to 60. Who here hasn't done that? So it would be this enthusiasm that she brought to everything that could be charming and also, I'm sure, maddening to the people around her. Just hang on just a minute. Don't go immediately to outrage. Give it a minute, My criticism of John, it's pretty minor, but I do think he kind of operated in a world of his own head, which is attractive in some ways, and in other ways, I won't go into the whole story, but he was involved with the manumission of a minister in Connecticut who had left to escape slavery, and then went to Germany, got a PhD, was quite a learned man, came back, and John Hooker was involved in his freedom, and went to a big event to welcome the minister, PhD minister, back. And he gave this speech, and I'm reading it thinking, that's not funny, where he says, I held on to his papers as if he owned this man just to see what it felt like. No, I don't know what it felt like, but I think that joke would make me feel like smacking you one. That was inelegant and inartful. And I wish I could have been at the crowd. Did everyone hear that? and he would do those kinds of things like his wife, which may have made them perfect together. And then they would call each other on, did you have to say that? I guess I did, or could you have soft pedaled that? I guess I couldn't. And that's not really a critique. I mean, he's very human. And I do congratulate the Stowe Center, because this is the kind of history we do need to see, that they were not on pedestals. Nobody's on a pedestal, that she had her faults, as did certainly Isabella and John. And I think that should probably serve for us an indication that we have our faults. We do and say things we wish we hadn't, but we can still be effective. Yes, sir.
That incident reminded me of a question that's been on my mind about the James Pennington, point about holding him an extra day just to see what it would feel like to hold a human being, as property.
Yeah.
It's made me wonder about whether that might have been one of the many, I'm sure, inspirations for Huck Finn, and the way that toward the end there, without spoiling the book, you can block your ears now if you don't want to hear, toward the end, Tom Sawyer makes something quite similar, makes it much more difficult than it would have needed to be to free Jim.
Yeah.
I've often wondered about whether that was one of the neighborhood anecdotes that inspired.
That's a great question. I don't know. I do not know. I just, and I'm not trying to be precious here, but when you're making light of someone's slavitude, I can't imagine the time frame when that would be funny or acceptable. I don't know. And it made me think a little bit about John Hooker. Like, was it a power thing? Did you need to feel powerful because you didn't actually own that man? And anyway, you have a lot of good questions. You should give the next speech here. Anyone else? Probably want to go home. Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed. You've allowed me to indulge my obsession. Thank you.
I want to thank everyone again for coming today. Please check out our store on the way out. There's some refreshments as well. And my colleague Laura asks if you could leave your name tags with us. We'd be most gracious and appreciative. Thank you. We hope you'll look for our calendar of events on our website and be back especially for Stowe Prize Part 2 on September 22nd. It's going to be live streamed here from the Stowe Center, so you can watch it at home, or you can come bring a picnic and watch it on the big lawn with us. Enjoy. Thank you.